Welcome to the Waterpeople podcast. I'm Lauren Hill, and my co-host is Dave Rastovich. We're wrapping up the third season of Waterpeople today by turning the mics on one another. Stay tuned for a meandering chat between myself and Dave that addresses some of the most common questions we get from listeners, some random surf adventure stories, and probably a little more romantic gushing than was necessary or intended. Somehow we managed to completely skip over the impetus for the whole conversation, which was the fact that we'd just come out of many weeks of isolation. Our 4-year-old broke his leg a couple of months ago, then we all got COVID. And in Dave's true nature as an extremist, he managed to break out with perhaps the world's only case of COVID pox, that is simultaneous COVID and adult chickenpox. It was an exhausting month, and we were really grateful just to sit down and chat for a couple of hours. So thanks for listening with us. And please don't be shy to reach out with comments, questions, and suggestions for who we should invite to join us for season 4, which will launch in May or June of this year. Our podcast comes to you from the coastal land and waters of both the Bundjalung and Gubbi Gubbi nations. We'd like to acknowledge these traditional custodians and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We'd also like to extend that respect to all First Nations people this podcast ripples out toward.
Where do we begin, Lauren?
We should begin where we always begin. People ask me about our opening question about a time or experience after which they or I was never the same. And so based on those conversations, I thought it would be interesting for us to turn the mic on one another and bombard each other with questions, or at least address that opening question and see where it leads.
That's a great question that generally stops people in their tracks, I reckon. You know, like, do you find that when we're out in the world and you might ask that of someone, they go, and really have quite a big pause. And then when we have conversations with people for the podcast, there is usually a little bit of a lead up where they can ponder that question more, and it generally reveals a few life insights for people, it feels like. Don't you reckon? People
usually it's a way to go relatively deep, or at least personal, relatively quickly. But I also really like observing the kind of not generic responses, but the step aside responses about, oh yes, I've had many experiences, people who dodge the question. And for me, that's always a matter of not wanting to get too personal, which is totally fine. We never push when people have that response, but I always reflect on those experiences and go, okay, that person doesn't want to go there right now, or maybe ever. And that's part of who they are too. And I think that that's interesting as well.
Yeah. And in general, we don't feel like those moments are the greatest stories either. Because you like,
sure,
the vulnerability hasn't revealed itself and been embraced. It's kind of like, oh, I don't really want to go there and talk about something, at that point, like you say. And maybe we're the wrong people too. They're looking at us like, I'm not telling you my secrets.
Fair enough.
But I was curious when we started talking about this, what your response to that question would be.
You sprung it on me. You asked me before I could ask you. I've thought about this a lot. I've had a few people ask me this question, and you'd think I would have sat with myself and had my own canned response before, but I don't really. I guess I've spoken to the fact on several episodes of the podcast that pregnancy and becoming a parent for me was one of those absolutely life-changing experiences, and it continues to be in new ways all the time, but also just foundationally after our very tumultuous experience with growing Minoa, I just felt like a different person and have been filled with a sense of gratitude and really hunger for life in a way that I would say I maybe didn't have beforehand. But I don't want to tell that story again. There's another story about us meeting and that glimmer of love really shaping and changing who I am. But there's another story that's small but had a big impact. And it is a vulnerable story. I've never really told it outside of kind of small women's circles, only once or twice, really. And that experience was from when I was in elementary school. I was playing on the sort of dirt kickball field, and 3 boys came up to me and pinned me against their bodies, and they proceeded to kind of like play rape me. And this is a really intense story. I didn't want to jump into this straight away, but there was just this feeling of powerlessness and being attacked. And I don't remember what I was thinking at the time. I was probably 7 or 8, and we were just out of eyesight from teachers, so no one could see us, and there weren't any other kids around because we were kind of in like the desert of the playground. And this was on Anastasia Island in Florida, where I went to school. And I don't remember what I felt in my body or in my mind necessarily during, but I remember after, when they let me go. I remember my child mind envisioning myself and feeling like a doe, like a deer escaping, fleeing, frolicking from this potentially violent attack. And it's hard to talk about it because nothing really happened, but something definitely happened. You know, a really bad thing didn't happen. And I'm aware of how lucky I've been. I mean, 1 in 3 women and girls are subject to physical or sexual violence in their lifetime. And I don't know if this counts as that or not, but it shaped me, and it shaped the way I felt as a girl, as a woman in the world. I had a sense of being different from boys, and also this very clear sense of being hunted. And that was where the deer kind of metaphor led me as I got older, was as a girl growing into a young woman's body. I had this sense of huntedness that felt unsafe, that felt like prey. And when people ask me about feminism and why I think it's relevant, why I still think it's relevant, and ecofeminism, you know, this overlap between environmental and gendered ways of moving through the world or understanding the world, I really can trace it back to that experience of this feeling akin to being hunted in the way that we pursue animals as prey.
It's really, I'm really sorry that happened, and I understand that your passion for feminism and for women feeling safe and empowered and educated and everything it comes from such a deep place for you. And there's lots of other things that have contributed to that over the years as a single mum and lots of things. But one of the things I wanted to go to was skipping forward to another moment where you felt hunted, and this relates directly to the surfing world, when you have spoken about attending one of the surf trade shows, which is where all the surf companies peddle their products and try and sell things and everything. And it's like in a huge building where, you know, everyone's enclosed except bikini girls walking around, you know, either serving drinks or handing out stuff. And you've spoken about being a young girl there of 14 or so. Yeah. And it sounded very much the same, that you were walking around and you just felt like prey.
Yeah, it was a very similar feeling. It was this thread that really ran through my young adulthood. I hope women and girls and boys and men don't feel that now. I hope we're beyond that, but I suspect that we aren't. And what I was going to refer back to is around the same time I had this sort of bizarre play rape experience. Those are weird words to put together. I don't know if that's the right terminology at all, but those are just the words that I have in my mind about what happened for me. I'd also experienced what school administrators called sexual harassment, which is a very strange thing for a primary school student to experience. But boys were grabbing my body, basically, 2 boys in particular, and I would, you know, look back and they'd be walking after me and they were, you know, trying to grab me in ways that were inappropriate. And, you know, no judgment to the people who handled the situation, but I remember my mom was called because of it, and I was sent home from school because of it. I don't know, maybe the same thing happened for the boys, I'm not sure, but there was just this feeling of unsafeness, around the idea of just being a girl. And those experiences really shaped, the way I moved through the world after that. Just trying to, stay safe, stay, maybe more covered up than I would have. Maybe less embodied than I would have in an overt way had I grown up in what felt like a, safer place to have a womanly body. And then later, I didn't really reckon with this story, which also still feels like a small thing, but it's this tiny little thread that's run, and that really made me want to do work to make other people feel safe in the world. And I really had that reckoning with my own story at university when I started participating in putting on the Vagina Monologues, the play by Eve Ensler. It's a beautiful theater production that's funny and wild and heartbreaking and tragic all at the same time. And we ended up having these women's circles and conversations to, offer up our own personal experiences of some of the subject matter. And it was just profound to be able to connect with other young women who had experienced similar things or very different things, but to see these threads of gender-based attack or violence or just unsafety running through our lives. And then also to be able to transform that, to go, yes, we all have pain, we all have trauma, whether they're micro traumas or macro traumas, and we can transform that into something that is positive and powerful. And through the Vagina Monologues, that meant raising, putting on this play, having an epic time, bringing joy and laughter and humor to something that is usually quite heavy subject matter. And the Vagina Monologues tends to circle around domestic violence, which I'd also witnessed in my home as a young child. So that was another element that shaped my idea of gender in the world. But the Vagina Monologues also encouraged us to reach out and to raise funds for local domestic abuse shelters and to support other women who were having maybe deeper or were further along the line of this sort of trauma, to be able to connect the dots and have these conversations publicly. And so those experiences are all kind of tied up together, but have really shaped how I feel about activism, how I approach activism, and how imperative a sense of joy and humor is, no matter what subject matter you're working with. Yeah, and that's a little bit about, I guess, the roots of my feminism.
It sounds to me also that you would feel quite alone and very vulnerable in those moments when those actions are happening, and that as a way to heal from that and to overcome that, women are coming together and sharing their stories that really dissolve that feeling of aloneness and create a feeling of solidarity, and then hopefully that really expresses itself in the form of funds raised or houses created for domestic violence victims, and that there is such a tangible outcome from those gatherings, those evenings, those raucous, funny and very heartbreaking, amazing evenings. And I feel like there's that thread in your life where those things are so close to your heart and you're so passionate about them, and you're also equally passionate about the ocean and surfing and playing and being joyful and grateful. And there's been this really fantastic blending of those two threads in your life since we've been together, where when we first got together, 10, 11 years ago, 12, you weren't really surfing the way you are now.
Yeah.
You'd come out of university, surfing was a bit on the back burner. It was like, it was there, but it sort of wasn't like it is now. And they were almost like these two exclusive threads in your life. And there's been this bringing together of those two things that help you cope with, I guess, the heaviness and the immensity of gender issues and the confrontations and the challenges of being a woman in this weird modern world. But then, the play of surfing and also living where we live on the north coast of New South Wales, where there are so many women surfing. There are grandmas in the water, there are aunties, there are many generations all the way down to the little Grammies that are now close friends who are young women, and watching you blend into that community that is here and really feel empowered and excited and so stoked to see multi-generational women surfing, sharing lineups, and moments where there are still gross things happening in the water, you know, where women are still prey in the water, you know, men in the water are lurking and have strange motives or treat women poorly in the water. Those things still happen here.
And they still matter. And I think that, I mean, you know, when you think about the small thing that happened to me or the series of small things that have happened to me in comparison to what happens to many women and girls, it still matters because violence against women and girls, toward women and girls, comes from a similar place. It comes from this power over paradigm that boys and men have been encouraged to develop. And, you know, it starts with small things, with words, with small actions. And that's what, you know, makes more violent actions possible. And so it feels like, you know, addressing gender in the surf industry, which I've done for a long time in a really kind of annoying, shouty, complaining kind of way, even to myself. That's why that always mattered to me. It's because it's this progression of creating our culture, you know, within our minds first, and then in our families, and then in our schools, and then in our lineups, and in our communities at large. And I just always felt like if I could play a small role in bringing up the discussion and casting a bit of light on conversations that tend to be shaded and taboo and held in secrecy, mostly in the minds and the hearts of people who have been violated, then that could make some small difference.
Oh, certainly. I see that all the time with people speaking about the way you illuminate areas of the surfing culture in ways that hadn't been spoken of before, and from the inside out. It's not like a critique from some New York Times person or whatever. It's like you're living and breathing a surfing life, and so you have the ability to speak from the inside in such a real way. And it's really valuable.
That's very kind. Another thing you know about me, no doubt, is that I'm much more comfortable asking questions than being the one being asked questions. So I'm going to flip it now. Dave, can you tell us about a time or experience after which you were never the same?
Man, I would like to go in many directions when answering that. I've had a very fortunate life so far and had lots of adventures and tried a lot of new things and fallen on my face a lot and hopefully learnt from those failings. And I have decided to go the love route and speak about when we first met, because probably if anyone has heard or read anything that has come from me in the surfing world, they're probably tired of hearing some of my surfing perspectives. And I do feel like our meeting was such a bend in the river of this life. And so when we first met, we were both in our 20s. We were both in relationships, and you were visiting the North Coast on a university exchange style thing at Lismore, and you were hanging with a friend, mutual friend, surfing, and we got to go surfing together. And I remember at the time I was very happy in the relationship I was in. I fully assumed it would go on for a long time. And though when we met, I couldn't shake this feeling that you were someone significant in my life, and I couldn't say why. And there was a feeling that was different to many other feelings I've had when I've encountered significant people in my life, where I've felt often a feeling of shared history with someone. Like you feel a familiarity even though you've just met, feel really familiar. And I had that many times, but when we met, it was the opposite. It was the other direction in the circle of time where it felt like I'd leaped forward. I was just feeling like, whoa, this young woman is significant and stunning.
Not just because I was a hairy, radical feminist coming
that
through you.
and much more. But it was just this jump forward thing, and it was just like, whoa, I feel like we have a future of interaction, a future of shared experience in some way that I can't describe. And I was just shocked by you. I couldn't believe you existed and that you were this incredibly gifted, beautiful, graceful surfer, which to me means so much, because when I watch people surf, I feel like I feel like I see their whole personality in the way they surf. You can kind of pick apart someone's makeup just by the way they stand on a surfboard and move their body and the way they interact with water. And, it's kind of like that whole, the way I do anything is the way I do everything sort of thing. And so when I saw you surf, I was just amazed that you were so relaxed. You were so carefree. It looked like you just didn't give a shit what anyone thought about what you were doing on a wave. You're just standing there playing, but you had so much skill and you were so aware, and then you have this bright mind, and we'd have these conversations where I think I wasn't yet a vegan. I was starting my conservation efforts with Sea Shepherd and lots of other crew, but I hadn't really fully dived into that world yet. Yet here you were, the hairy armpitted vegan eco-feminist surfer. And I was just baffled by you. It was just incredible. But we were in other relationships, both of us. So we shared a look, and we later discovered that we both had that feeling of familiarity in a forward-leaping way.
But
and
a time-stopping look.
Yeah.
It was
really magical. And, we've spoken of it many times with people before, but a friend was talking story and we just tuned out and were looking at each other and just staring into each other's eyes for a moment that felt infinitely large and too small. I wanted it to be longer. But it was just beautiful. And then we went our separate ways and didn't see or speak to each other for a few years, until then I became single and I saw this beautiful backlit hang 10 photo of you in a paisley shirt with a tie and your hair kind of up in a beehive that had come undone, and the light all around and inside you it was beautiful. And it was almost like that moment when we were looking into each other's eyes was just stopped me. And so I reached out straight away, and we started talking, and then the larger story of our relationship unfolding is quite a long one, but I would prefer just to focus on that moment of magic. And that even though life seemed not railroaded but quite set, there was a rhythm to life then, for me anyway. I had a wonderful partner at the time, was living in a beautiful place, was very blessed, surfing lots, travelling heaps, working on really important things to me in dolphin and whale conservation. And I just felt like I had this groove, but then this Floridian spark just came, and it was just so beautiful. And you were so beautiful. And then when the years passed, and then we had an opportunity where both of us became single at the same time and reached out and started writing poetry and silly jokes and speaking to each other all the time and conjuring up how we would get back together and share some surfing time or whatnot. That was just very magical and unexpected. And it changed me in a way where I felt like even the most embedded things in my life, the things I feel could never change, could change, could be pretty tumultuous, big relationship ending and those sort of transitions, moving where you live, all of those things. You were on the other side of the planet. How possibly could you come and live here? How could I go to Florida and live? Don't think that's going to happen. All those things that I felt were kind of immovable, where they're just set, and wonderfully set. were just that way. And then flip, it all gets tossed by a clean-up set and everything gets washed clean and new, and it might be turbulent for a while, but when it settles down, there's a whole new world there, and that was magical and still is.
It was, and I totally agree. Thank you. That was a really beautiful recounting. I love hearing you tell that story. I remember how brave, you are, but also how brave you were to drop everything and come and see me in Florida when I was having doubts. I thought, one thing I love about you is you have this great vision that it's like you can see through the tumult of whitewater or through nebulousness. And you had this vision that I couldn't see, that I was having second doubts, and I went back to Florida and it just seemed too difficult. It seemed like too much work to be able to move across the planet, to move in with someone, because I wasn't going to move to Australia and like rent a share house down the road. We were going to go all in or nothing.
Yeah, straight away.
That felt really intense as a 25-year-old.
And also moving into a shoebox cabin in the bush with no power, no hot water.
Yeah.
No nothing.
It was a major change.
From what you'd grown up with. And yeah, it was both of us. It was just the brave nature of love,
Yeah, it wasn't easy. It was a magical first glimpse, time defying. But it definitely wasn't all easy after that, was it?
No.
And then your dad passed away shortly after
That's
we'd been
right.
together. 6 months.
We were just thrown in the deep end so heavily. You were quite sick. We were in a new ecology. It rained like Mordor for 3 years. We were living in a cabin next to a creek.
I had weird fungal infections all over my
things,
skin.
Leeches every day. It was just different. And then, the visa thing, trying to figure out how to live. How would you survive? What would you be doing for meaningful work? Who are your new friends?
Yeah, I left behind my community and the trajectory that I thought I was going to be going down to. But your dad passed away shortly after we'd been together.
Yeah.
And we talk a lot about the impact, the influence of our parents now in terms of parenting and how we live or choose to live differently. And I was really curious to ask you about the living legacy of your dad in your life now.
Well, Lauren, thank you for such a question. It's been a funny trajectory over the course of my life where I actually felt like my dad's influence on me was very dominant in between my father and my mother and their influences in my life. And I'd always had this sort of story in my head, like we all tell ourselves stories about our parents, and mine was until actually probably in my 30s when my dad left his body, was that I was my father's son, and there were lots of things about him that I wanted to grow out of and not continue on, which were, he was in special forces, sort of police, anti-riot squads and stuff. So he'd seen some pretty nasty sides of humanity, and that had rubbed off on me as a kid, where he was generally seeing the worst in people. Like even just driving on the road, he would assume people were, aggressive or doing nasty stuff, and he'd always be pretty aggro on the roads, or just sort of saw that side in people, and that rubbed off on me. And I was always a real loner as a kid, and generally didn't want to be in cities or busy places because of that. Actually, I'd just generally see the negative in people, and so I wouldn't want to participate. So there were things like that where he had rubbed off on me in lots of positive ways, like his sense of humour, his sense of awe and wonder and magic and amazing temperament with children. He was just such a man for kids, so entertaining, so adventurous, so magical. And I always have felt the same. So there's wonderful positives there. But there are also those tendencies that were sort of harmful and negative that I didn't want to perpetuate. But then into my 30s, I really started to discover how similar to my mum I was. And that, I had all these little subtle traits. My mum was much more the subtle one in my parents' relationship. My dad was huge and and just intense, and Mum was the peacekeeper and just very calm and light and happy, and just keep the peace, just don't stress so much, go to the beach, be in the water, be in Mama Nature, it's all good. And anyway, I started to really feel like my mum's influence in my life has been enormous, and in a lot of ways maybe more so than my dad.
More middle path.
Yeah, and I love that. And then seeing my mum now, who's this water woman that is picked up surfboard riding after years of paddling canoes and ocean swimming and doing lots of other stuff.
In her 60s.
Yeah, in her 60s. She's got a beautiful Dick Van longboard and is just a surf rat. And every time we all talk, she's telling us about her last surf where she got a 100-metre long ride, and her watch told her that she did 50 cutbacks and a couple air reverses and stuff. And it's just great. It's just really, really great. So I took a little bit of a turn there away from your question about my dad, because I do feel like my relationship with my parents, now that my dad hasn't been here on Earth for 10 years or so, it's really opened up this opportunity to see much more of my mum in me, and for that I'm super duper grateful. She's such a beautiful, bright spark.
She is.
Do you feel like that in terms, when you think about your parents, that your perspective on them has shifted over the years? Do you feel it's somewhat the same?
First, I feel like I have to begin this conversation by saying that I'm aware of the fact that there is no way to do parenting perfectly. And I respect that. And I think my parents did as well as they could have, especially my mom. She pretty much raised me single-handedly.
Amazing.
And worked multiple jobs to support us and to give us an incredibly abundant life despite, relatively little resource and very little support. We had no family around. I was at my dad's on the weekends, and my mom just did an incredible job. And because she was busy all the time, it ended up, her absence gifted me lots of alone time to learn how to be really comfortable in my own skin, in my own presence, to learn how to make my own fun. And there's some probably weird, quirky habits that came out of that. But I think overall, I'm just grateful that, my parents didn't stay together, because they weren't a good fit. And it was a huge blessing to not have to live in a household where there was arguing so much. I've just been reading Rudolf Steiner's Kingdom of Childhood lecture series, and he talks about how for teachers, it's not, in the Steiner or Waldorf mode of education, it's not what you say or how you're trying to educate children. It's who you are. That's important, because we learn by feeling out how people react, by watching the behaviors around us. And I feel that so acutely now as a parent with a young child, just thinking about, the most important thing I can do is be the best version of myself, the kindest version, the most compassionate and thoughtful and curious person. And you inspire so much of that in us as a family. But getting back to my family, I just always had a hunger for more of them. I think that's the predominant sense when I look back. I was hungry for more connection, for more intimacy, for more time just to play. They were so, and it's no judgment on them. They were really doing the best they could and trying to make a living and pay the bills. And it was not easy. But still I had needs that, could have been met differently. And I can see that now and appreciate that now and try to do better in my own parenting life.
I feel like the parental journey is just so rich for all of us. Everyone has an interesting parental story, and I feel like we all have something to learn from each other when we hear each other's stories of being a parent or being a child of parents, especially the dynamic nature of the last few decades, radical industrialized lives, like having to work so hard to look after your family, and fathers, falling into the provider role and really showing their love through working so hard.
And mothers falling into a martyrdom role so often.
It's just so loaded, you know. So we can't ever I feel like we just can't point the finger too harshly at any of us, towards each other in a way that's blamey or judgmental, because it's much more of a systemic issue of imbalance than it is personal. If people are we're just doing the best you can with what you got.
Helena Norberg Hodge speaks so beautifully to your point about how basically our culture is skewed away from any of us having the kind of real support, communal support and connectivity that we would have had in the past to create the sense of community that parents really need, because parenting was never meant to be done alone. In fact, it's next to impossible. It's a full-time job and then some. Yeah, I really like her work and her musings about this. I wanted to ask you...
No, I wanted to ask you about a surf story.
Oh, no.
You're doing that thing where you ask the questions all the time.
I'm not. I am.
Tell us a surf story, Lauren.
Okay.
One that bubbles up above the rest.
I'm just so grateful to be a surf rat right now. I did have a real period in life, like you said earlier, through my university years where I wasn't surfing very much. I was thinking a lot and not playing a lot, but surfing occasionally. Surfing was a real refuge during that period. I would drive to New Smyrna Beach from DeLand, Florida, which is about 30 minutes from the coast. And I'd get on the highway and turn the music up loud. And, well, speaking of my parents, I have the same musical taste as my dad, who's now 70. He's a southern white dude, and so I've inherited those classic rock tunes. Well, they're just enfolded deep into my brain.
Think Eagles. Think Creedence. Well, that's a good one. Steely Dan. They're great. I'm super grateful. I would rather that over like whatever.
Anyway, I'm just so grateful to have surfing in my life. It's shaped me it's just shaped every major decision I've made in my life, and I'm so grateful for that I've stayed true to it. And part of that has been getting to experience parts of the world I would have never imagined going to. And one of those trips was with you to Indonesia, around the Teles Islands. We were taking a little boat out to probably a bigger, more heroic wave that I was probably scared to surf, especially on a longboard.
Yeah.
But on the way, we motored past this little tiny sand spit, and at the time I was really, really obsessed with tiny waves. Growing up in Florida, that's the most natural obsession. And so I'd shaped my whole surfing life around riding big, heavy longboards and appreciating going slow and loving the subtlety of just like moving your weight into each one of your toes and your toe pads on your board. Because when you don't have much wave energy to work with, you have to figure out how to be creative. And that was how it played out for me. So anyway, we're in Indonesia with lots of big wave energy around us, but I didn't quite know what to do with it yet. I've had to grow into that a little bit more as I've gotten older. But at the time, I still had Shindonesian eye goggles on.
Yep.
And so we saw this tiny little wave breaking around this little sandspit island. And then we drove past it again, and it was completely submerged underwater pretty much. And then the tide was going to be right to where after we went and surfed the bigger wave, we'd come back and get off the boat, swim over to the island and see if we could surf it, because I thought it looked like just rideable. It was this peak that came in from the top of the island, let's say, and then peeled around as a left, but then it curved at the bottom around the like half circle mark. It curved around and then kind of turned into a right, because the wave almost did a complete 360 around this tiny sand island, and I wanted to see if I could go in a full circle around the island. And you and some of our friends had musical instruments. Ash Grunwald.
Scotty from Living End, bass player.
Yeah.
Yep. Colin Fingers Milan.
Yep.
And Brendan Margison, Margot.
Yep. Legendary free surfer. You guys were hanging out on the island, and I was just so stoked to be in this tiny little warm wavelet zone where I could paddle in and my fingertips would just touch the sand. It was super shallow, but the wave was just big enough to keep my fin off the sand, but leave this trail of sort of smoky sand, kicking up. So I got up and surfed around and then made my way to the bottom of the island and then kept going, and you guys were hooting and playing music.
We're only like 10
and then
feet
I kind
from
of
you.
cut back and almost touched dry sand, and then I kept going. I was going right at that point instead of left. And then a wedge came and sort of met up with the wave I was on and pushed me a little bit further. And then I didn't quite make the connection to full circle because it, the water got a bit confused.
Totally.
The water was like confused, meeting in multiple places. And so I didn't quite make it, but oh man, it was just one of those novelty experiences that I loved and I lived for at the time. And
unbelievable to watch. You did, pretty much, if you looked at it as a clock, you started at 12 o'clock and you surfed all the way around 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, I reckon to about 3.5, nearly 2 on the clock. Like you finished the wave probably only 20 feet shy of where you started the wave. Like I would say it's the closest to a full 360-degree ride anyone could have ever done.
I hope to go back there one day and try.
And it was a ride.
It probably
going
doesn't
round
even
and
exist
round.
anymore.
Yeah, it probably doesn't.
That little island's probably.
And what did you? And you were like, because we're really not into naming waves like a surf colonialist ding dong. So we were leaving, but you had a thought in your mind, and what was it about that wave?
It seemed to me that the name of that wave should be women's rights. Because it was this wave that seemed like one thing, but it was actually another thing. It started out as a left and turned into a right, and I feel like that with feminism sometimes it seems like it's this really radical, exclusive thing that's about only appreciating femininity, but really the underlying goal is equality and valuing everybody.
And women's rights should be on the radar at all times.
All right, you've got about 1 billion surf travel stories. Can you? Well, actually, I want to get more specific. We've been in a period of not traveling much lately. Does that make you miss travel at all?
No.
And can you think of a time when you went on a surf trip and it pretty much failed?
Fail happens for the project's goals, but not so much as a personal feeling of failure, because most surf adventures without surf turn into more culturally rich experiences, which is I always have really loved. So you, instead of being obsessed with the waves, you'd actually hang out with local people more and participate more, and sometimes remember that in ways you would never have remembered if it was just good surf, whatever good surf is, and bad, it's just a concept. So there's plenty of those, and some of those just turned into party-style binges of playing music and just being hedonistic. And others were challenges that just we just kept persevering with. And the one I think you're thinking of with me that is really interesting, because it's a story about the sign of the Surfing Times then, is about the Billabong seaplane idea. And it's a very long story, which has got hilarious twists and turns, so I'll try and make it more succinct. But essentially, for many years, the bigwigs at Billabong in the States had acquired 2 seaplanes, so amphibious planes, I think they were called albatross planes, that could land out in the ocean, in the channel, and then turn into a boat of sorts that you can go up to the wave, throw the anchor, and go surfing. And that this would open up all these places that were very difficult to get to otherwise. It was just absolutely bogged in red tape. It was an ex-military plane, so they could never get clearance to try and land it anywhere and do anything with it. It had been years of them trying, and it's a pretty fantastical idea. You think of it and you go, yeah, that'd be amazing. You just fly over huge swaths of coastline and pick a spot to surf, no humans in sight for hundreds of miles. So it's a pretty, big idea. And eventually the crew decided to do a trip into Mexico with the plane, and they had a Nat Geo team on the little plane. I think there's probably, 8 to 10 people on the plane, And so I was one of the surfers with Shane Dorian and a couple other cats. And we took off out of Southern California and flew down into Mexico. And we landed on a little sand airstrip right next to a beach and tented it overnight. Woke up in the morning and it was a bombing swell. Like, I think Todos Santos on that day was 20 to 30 feet. It was just huge. Probably the entire coast of Mexico was just pumping. But we woke up to see the ocean roaring and way overhead. And all of a sudden, a fog bank moved in. And we thought, oh, we better get out of here. So we jumped into the plane to get it going. And the plane got bogged in the sand. And so the next second, we're under the plane, digging out the wheels of the airplane to try and get it to get some speed down the sand strip and take off. So meanwhile, we're watching huge, perfect surf out there break. And we can't get off the ground. Eventually we get off the ground, fly up through this fog, get above it, start traversing the coast, eventually get to a point where we can see a huge headland, a very, very long headland, and just these 8-foot plus lines of swell peeling down this long, probably 2 kilometre long headland, absolute desert on the land, no one around, and we were like, wow, this is going to happen. This is about to work. We'd land in the channel and you got to land across the waves, and then we motor a little bit closer to the channel, still quite a way, probably 800 meters from the breaking waves, and we're all freaking out, and the pilot drops a pick and we jump out and start paddling. And there was a guy, Seth Stafford, who's an amazing water photographer, who was swimming with the housing. So he starts swimming and we're going to the headland. And then the pilot had inflated a tiny little rubber ducky boat with a little like whippersnipper 2-horsepower engine on the back. That was just pathetic. And so he was going to drop someone off in the lineup with that, and he could ferry people back and forth. Anyway, we get to the lineup and it's a quality wave, and all of a sudden the fog bank just socks in, and it is so thick that we couldn't even see the plane out in the channel. And about 20, 30 minutes go by, you can't even see the waves until they're on top of you breaking. It's like 8 to 10 feet, and we're just tripping.
Oh my gosh.
And about half an hour into that, we kind of huddled together, the few of us in the water. All of a sudden we hear the yee of the whippersnipper little rubber ducky coming out of the fog, and it's the pilot. And his eyes are enormous, and you can tell he's just freaking out. And he drives up to us and he says to Shane, Shane, red alert, I can't find the fucking plane. I've been driving this whole time, I can't find the plane. And for 30 minutes, he was like driving around the channel. He couldn't find the plane, so he came back to the lineup where he could hear the waves and eventually found us. And he just said, go to the beach. Speak to the houses. You just go stay somewhere on the beach. And there was like a dilapidated old stone fishing shack on the beach, like no roof, just walls. There was no humans there. The dude was peeking. And Shane's just like, what are you talking about? Relax. Like, we're not going to the fucking beach, man. Anyway, he turns around, just goes back into the fog. And we were all just laughing, like, this guy is just tapped. He's
Why was he out of the plane? Why was the pilot out of the plane?
He's just doing the trips. He wanted to have his dream come true too, and be a part of the whole thing and be in the water and whatever. Anyway,
was he surfing?
No.
Okay.
And so then it was probably 45 to an hour that we'd been out there. We couldn't see the plane, and then it clears and we could see the plane, and we were just like, I think we should go, and we should just like get back to the plane because this is a pretty heavy situation. And Seth, the guy swimming with his housing, had been washed down the point because there's big current and you can't beat a current when you're swimming. No. We could because we're on our boards. So we're like, shit, okay, well, let's just paddle to the plane. So we paddle, we quickly gun it while there was a break in the fog. We get back to the plane and Seth's nowhere to be found. We get on the plane, the pilot's taking shots of whiskey. He's getting super twitchy. He's like, we got to take off. We got to get out. We got to get out of here while there's a gap in the fog. And he's just peeking. We're like, dude, we're not leaving Seth. Like, we've got another human out there in a wetsuit. You're not going to leave him on this empty coast and just take off. And the guy's freaking. Next thing you know, he has to do a nervous shit. And so he poos.
You know all about that.
He poos. What are you talking about? He poos into a plastic bag and is about to throw it in the ocean. And because we're in this tiny little plane, you're all just shoulder to shoulder, right? And it's just disgusting. And we're like, dude, you can't throw your freaking poop in the ocean in a plastic bag, but we don't want it on board either. And he's having more shots of whiskey and he's just making us feel very uncomfortable and nervous that he's the pilot. Anyway, we're looking at the headland, scanning, and we finally see Seth, this little guy, walking along the rocks, going way up the point so he could jump in the water and get washed down by the current enough to swim back to the boat. And we were just keeping the pilot at bay, making sure we didn't leave. Finally, we see one arm swimming through the deep water and he gets back to the plane. The pilot's like, all right, everyone, we're out of here. Pulls the pick up, goes to take off, and it's like 10-foot swell. And so you got to take off crossways. You can't go towards the waves because it's too violent and you can't really go with them. You're sort of going across the swell line. So we do that and it's like super loud. It's an old school plane, prop plane, super duper loud, and we're flying along and we're like, oh, never mind, we almost got it that way. I think we got like 2 or 3 waves each. And the first bounce of the plane, everyone's like, woohoo! Like we're all, stoked, having a good wild time.
You made it.
The second bounce, which is more violent, no one says anything. And the third bounce is just white knuckles and a few of us let out little squeals like, ah! And then I think it was the fourth bounce is when you get enough bounce to get lift and start taking off into the air. It was like that scene in Almost Famous where the band members say, I'm gay, I slept with your wife. I did, It was like that, where everyone was all of a sudden feeling like this is the end of our lives. And anyway, we teeter and toter and we get up in the air, get through the fog, and we get above the fog and it's just beautiful and clear. And by that time, it was the end of the day. We'd had this long, weird day and we weren't going to be able to make it back to the sand airstrip that we started the day at. And so the pilot is like, we're going to have to find another runway somewhere on mainland Mexico and just land. And hopefully it's not a drug cartel spot that just wants to take our plane and kill us all or something. And so he finds a runway on his map and we just go inland where the fog doesn't reach and we land. And sure enough, as soon as we land, a truck full of dudes with machine guns comes driving up to the plane, and the pilot gets us all to give him any cash we have. And he gets out and he's like, I'll take care of it. We're like, oh, great. This dude who's just peeking is going to, negotiate. And anyway, he pulls it off and gives them the money. They're all laughing and stupid gringos, and that we are. And we jump in the back of the truck. They take us to the nearest little, beat up town in the middle of nowhere. And there's a tiny little hotel, like single floor little pit to stay in. And so we just have to sleep there that night. Shano and I get into the room and there's a little TV on the wall up near the ceiling in a cage so you don't steal it. And there's 2 little mattresses on the floor and just a seedy vibe. Anyway, we all go to sleep, wake up in the morning. I wake up just itching like crazy and I'd gotten bed bugs and nits. And so my head was on fire from this freaking bed. And just before we went to bed, we watched this movie on that little TV called The Fog, where this fog rolls into a town and everyone wants to kill each other when the fog comes. And so Shane and I were just laughing at the timing of that. Get back to the airstrip, take off, and we're like, okay, today we're going to do it. We learnt something yesterday. We'll do better today. And we ended up finding this enormously long, crazy Mundaka-style left point break river mouth thing, like just the longest wave in front of an estuary. We land the plane. We're like, there's no fog. Everyone's high-fiving. We're like, yes, we're doing it. We throw the anchor. We're in the estuary in front of the wave. We jump in. We start to paddle out. And then we realize that there's a current that's going like 20 knots and we all get washed down the coast and don't get anywhere near the wave. We get into the land, we do this huge walk, we go way past the plane, jump in and try and paddle back to the waves. Can't do it, so we just try and make it to the plane and without getting washed past it again. We somehow get to the plane, get on the plane and are just watching flawless waves peel off in front of us and none of us can get to it. And we can't use the little whippersnipper rubber ducky to get to the waves like you would with a boat or a jet ski because it's 2 horsepower. So we just watch these perfect waves, can't get to them, and we get all huddled up in the plane and basically realised that it's a failure. And millions of dollars had been spent by then, for sure, on the plane and all these other aspects of the idea. And it's a total flop. And the Nat Geo guys are there just laughing, like, look at these dingbat surfers. Like, you guys are just running the lamest show here. Like, what are you doing? You don't know what you're doing. And we didn't. And so we get in the plane, pull the pickup, and fly back to San Diego in California, and it's done. And so that was at a time when the surf companies had so much money and so many grand ideas and so little conscience for the products that we're making, so little interest in our backstory. It was all about the upfront stuff of big contests and big movies and big ideas and all this fantastical stuff. And that plane was one of those ideas. And I respect the crew for having a dream and a vision and giving it a shot. But it was very excessive and it was a complete failure. And we got back to California and I was scratching. I looked like a junkie that was just clawing at his skin, and we were all so just over it. And anyway, after that, it was, to me, it was a real sign of excess in the industry and of complicating something so simply wonderful and pure as a person on a wave that comes infinitely varied and for free from Mama Nature, and all we need to do is just be there with that. And that is such a gift and a stoker. You can do that for your entire life, as we've seen, like the great Peter Cole, who just left his body in Hawaii, 91 years old, surfing his whole life. People like Woody Brown surfing his whole life. All these amazing women surfing into their 70s, 80s. Like, it is enough to just ride a wave. We are so blessed to have our health and space and clean enough water to surf and ride these beautiful, free, infinitely varied waves. And so to me, it was just crystal clear then. I was like, okay, the pendulum has swung so far in the excess realm with the surf industry with an idea like that. We really need to learn a lesson from that and not do that again, you know. And so anyway, that was a pretty funny story of a flop of a trip, but a great experience.
That makes me think we need to have Shane Dorian on the podcast to recount his side of that story.
He would laugh his head off. He'll never forget that moment. Speak to the houses, red alert.
Well, from the sort of spirit of excess of the surf industry to the sort of very personal and place-based philosophies that I feel like you've grown into, there's a particular saying that I'd love for you to speak to, and that is, let's wake up and see. Who said it and what does it mean to you?
Wake and see. That is Greeno to a T. So, yeah, we have really grown into a couple that is non-committal to the nth degree.
You've really corrupted me in this way. I had a predisposition, and you've really, really
opened you up to that. Yes. Yeah.
I'm grateful, but it's annoying for everyone else.
It is annoying for people, especially if they're not surfers, to deal with our devotion to just really dancing with the weather. And I feel like that's how it is. Like, we just, you wake up and see the trees bending over, blowing eastward from a west wind, and we're like, ooh, I know one place right now that would be so beautiful. Let's go there. And that's what we do. But that really stems from George, that saying of wake up and see, because many years ago, I remember wanting to catch up with him and talk about fin design or something, and I was like, it was probably a Sunday or a Monday. I was like, what are you doing Thursday, George? Like, it was 4 days out, and wanting to connect with him on an Arvo or something, and he just laughed at me. He's like, that's 4 days from now. I have no idea what I'm going to... Tide could be a little bit higher than I thought. The wind might drop. I could go fishing. 4 days from now? What the hell? What are you talking about? And I felt like such a doofus. I felt like I was missing the point. I really felt like just a neurotic ding-dong for trying to plan something with someone like him, a wild man like him, that far out. And it really made an impact. I was like, okay, that's interesting. Here is this man who's, now he's 80 and surfing, gardening, out in his boat, designing, full of ideas, vibrant and hilarious. And that's part of his strategy. That's part of the way he lives and grows is just waking up and seeing what's happened, feeling it.
At the same time, it feels like the ultimate privilege, to be able to afford enough of your own time, which sounds ridiculous, to be able to have absolute flexibility to move with the wind as it blows, and to adapt each day to what the living world's actually doing around us. But at the same time, it's also kind of like the basic way that our species has always lived. The way we're living now is a radical departure from the way we used to shape life in terms of daily, weekly, and yearly time.
Apologies for the interruption, but we'd like to take a moment to recognize the generous folks who help make this podcast possible. The Waterpeople podcast is brought to you by the fine folks at Sanuk. In 1997, founder Jeff Kelly started out with one simple goal: to make people smile and to encourage them to pass it on. Sanuk has been advocating for a more playful and inclusive surfing culture for more than 2 decades, while crafting some of the comfiest footwear around. Thanks to Sanuk for your support and for encouraging water people around the globe to protect their happy places. Learn more about Sanuk's partnership with the Surfrider Foundation at sanuk.com.
Thanks to Gary McNeil Concepts, who put together cosmic boards for cosmic people. Gaz's boards combine recycled and plant-based materials that are built to last without sacrificing performance. To learn more, head to GaryMcNeilConcepts.com.
We love to live an analog life in many ways, but one of the ways that I love to engage with technology is through podcasts. And obviously we have a podcast. We both enjoy the process of getting to connect with people that we respect and admire in meaningful ways, to sit down and have these conversations. Even just the two of us doing this has been a sweet way to connect. Are there any podcasts that you listen to?
No, Lauren, there isn't.
Okay. Well,
How did you assume that I would have a secret podcast that I hadn't told you about?
I don't always drive with you. I thought maybe in the car. My go-to.
So, Lauren, do you have a podcast that you listen to?
My go-to in the car is The Moth.
That's...
It's funny how...
I have never typed in one of their things to listen to. I love their distillation of 50 stories into a book.
Yeah.
The Moth, Occasional Magic.
It's just the ultimate storytelling podcast that fully inspired us to sit down and do this.
That's what started it.
And what I wanted to just take a moment to do was to just express gratitude for anyone who's been listening with us along the way, because it's been such a source of joy to get to have a reason to sit down and make these conversations happen, and also to create a space where we can touch on kind of, radical concepts and out there ideas, but in a way that's non-confrontational and non-aggressive.
Yeah, really grateful for people tuning in and also sharing, because I'm not on the net and talking to people that way. It's mostly, for me, face-to-face encounters, usually out in the lineup surfing somewhere where I'll probably be a little antisocial and paddle off to a separate peak to myself, and someone will follow me and I'll think, oh, what's going on here? But they will paddle over and perhaps say how much a conversation that we shared meant to them. And that's really wonderful. It's really been a sweet surprise, wouldn't you say, that kind of encounter?
Okay, so no podcasts for you. Are there any books that you have tended to gift more than other books?
Oh, that's right. Well, I feel like the last year has been such a rich book year for me. I will rattle them off. Richard Powers, the Overstory book, centered around trees, completely changed the way I perceive and interact with trees. And we're surrounded by a lot of trees here, so that's a really significant book for me. And then his next book was called Bewilderment, and that was equally stunning, just beautifully written. Sand Talk by Tyson Younger Porter, Indigenous wisdom from here in Australia. Currently I'm rereading, I'm sure I read this book a long time ago, but I'm reading Braiding Sweetgrass, which is by a beautiful woman from North America, Native American woman and scientist, Robin Wall Kimmerer, I think her name is. Incredible, just so beautiful. And that's also a lot about plants and interacting with plants.
You're listing your favorite books, but you're not actually answering the question that I asked.
Sorry, what was it?
Which is there a book that you have gifted more than any other book? Like, if you're going to give someone a book, what book is it? Just a book that you love, that you always feel enthusiastic to share.
Oh, I really, for a while, and I probably still would do this, depending on the recipient, but Ben Okri's Astonishing the Gods, which was gifted to me by Albie Falzon. And Astonishing the Gods, what a beautiful title. And this man's book, he's a very successful, well-known writer. I think Nigerian descent, living in Europe perhaps, or America. But Astonishing the Gods is this book where a whole chapter could be a single sentence, and it was a sentence so perfectly crafted and beautiful and just scintillating, like it was dancing on the page. And for me, having Albie refer that book to me or gift that book to me, and then my experience of it was just so unusually written and so beautiful. Like every word was so meticulously attended to. And I could barely tell you what it's about, because it's about a man looking for an invisible city and he finds it. And I don't even know how to explain it, but I love that because it instills such a sense of awe in all things human and beyond human that I really love. I love that feeling of just being in grateful awe of something. And that book is just full of that. So I like passing that one on.
We're going to work on making a complete Waterpeople podcast book list. We're going to start crafting that list, and we'll share it soon. I think probably my most gifted book is Women Who Run with the Wolves by Clarissa Pinkola Estes, about the wild woman archetype mythology from across cultures. It's a beautiful and mesmerizing book. You mentioned the idea of beautifully crafted. I was just listening to a podcast that was speaking to the way that because our culture has become increasingly secular, and by that I mean less rigidly religious in a way that at least American culture tended to be and European cultures tended to be, the way toward shaping our lives in an ethical and sort of moral way might be focusing more on the craft, whatever your craft is, focusing on the quality of a practice for a particular endeavor. I don't know that you think about surfing as your craft, but I think maybe other people would, that's what you...
They can see it
That's
that way.
what you have spent that's what you choose to spend your life, your time shaping, your experience around the ocean and refining your understanding of water and moving through water, and that's really become your craft. It's your life and your life.
And for me, it's not a craft because I don't create anything from it. At the end of it, there's no product. There's a feeling, but there's nothing else. And though I have had layers of other stuff attached to it, like sponsorship and all the other things from pro surfing stuff, it isn't a craft for me. Essentially, it is nature worship in action. And I'm just so head over heels for it that it just spills out in a way that perhaps other people are interested in. And then that's when other things get attached to it, like sponsorship and surfboard design and all that sort of stuff. But essentially it's nature worship in action, like the Sufi mystics dancing, like the whirling dervishes, like a Christian pilgrim walking sacred trails and moving with awe and grace and wonder. It's in action. In Buddhism there's lots of active meditations and walking meditations and whatnot. So for me, surfing is like that. the center of it, it is like that. And that's probably why I don't find myself surfing in crowds very often, why I seek solace most of the time, like you would going into a church or a cathedral or something, or a temple or a cave. It mostly feels like that to me. And it changes, and we go surfing with all our friends and play with the kids, and there's lots of other aspects of it. But essentially, that's what it is for me. And especially now as I grow older, it feels more and more clear that that's what it is for me. And you know what I'm like if I haven't surfed in a while. It's like not going and being grateful and being full of thanks and clarity like you would with the structure of going to church every Sunday. That's what that fulfills for a lot of people.
That's really beautiful. I want to reflect on an episode that we recorded most recently with Fergal Smith. I was curious to know how Fergal's take on animal husbandry landed for you.
Yeah, we were talking about this because Fergal was really excited about how swiftly working with animals and integrating them into regenerative practices on land with the growing of fruit and veggies, how swiftly those animals aided in the reparation of the land and regenning the land. And he was really excited, wasn't he? More about that than just growing veggies and fruit.
Yeah, well, and I wanted to preface this question. I didn't do that, but I'll do it now. Because we were having a conversation recently and you said that, quote, if you're not somewhat uncomfortable about your food, then you're probably not close enough to it.
Yeah.
So I wanted you to elaborate on that.
Yeah. Why do I feel like you're in the driver's seat here and I'm just trying to flick things back to you and you're like, no. You really do like asking the questions.
I do.
Okay, well, I hope we hear from you as soon as I finish blah-blahing. That was a real epiphany for me after that. That was that feeling of when I dive and get some fish for us, when I pull out plants from the garden, when I lift up a potato plant and pull all of those little babies of that plant that wonderful little plant has strived to create and then just flourish, and then here I come, this big ogre, pulling them out. I'm doing so very gratefully, but it is, to me, a very similar experience, the feeling of both of those things. And so then having that sort of confrontational feeling, that understanding that something has gifted its entire life for our bodies and the life in our bodies to continue, it is a little uncomfortable. It's a tense. There is tension in there. And then you go to the shop, because we do grow a lot of food here and we can collect at the beaches, and we have that contrast of doing so and then going to a store and handing over some plastic and some coins for food generally wrapped in plastic or paper. And there's no eyes looking up at you. There's no wilting of the leaves as you grab it. It's already been pulled, probably processed and packaged and trucked all kinds of places before it reaches you there. And there's no feeling to me. There's nothing there. I'm grateful that I have the resource to buy food, but there's none of that realness that pulls at your heart and does something in your belly, you know. So that was how it felt to me, and that's felt that way a long time because I wasn't eating fish or any other meats or anything like that for a long time until we...
A lot of people still assume that you're vegan.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
But we were pregnant and you were really needing iron and needing that, and I didn't want to go to a shop and buy things that are wrapped in plastic from other sides of the world that might be iron-rich but just are plant-based. It didn't make sense to me to do that when we live here where there are populations of fish coming and going each season, and that I could go down there and really gratefully and very humbly ask for a fish, get a fish, and feed you that way.
I don't know.
And that's what changed it.
I don't know if fish is particularly high in iron, but I definitely know I needed... there was a distinct difference in the feeling in my body with eating animal protein, specifically fish, versus vegetable protein. And we'd been vegetarian or vegan for quite a long time.
It really dawned on me, chatting with him, the significance of localizing with our food, and that our garden here that grows a lot of food and we share it with a lot of others, and there's no money involved It's just a gifting, great experience. But it is also one of those, the personal is political type of experiences, because every basket of food we pull out of that garden is not a basket of food that averages thousands and thousands of kilometres of road miles, fuel miles in Australia here. The average food basket from your supermarket has thousands and thousands of those food miles in it. So to me, that's another great moment of realising, oh, this is a personal choice, but it has bigger ramifications.
Also, in that episode with Fergal, I realized that you had managed to slip in the concept of ahupua'a into probably 13 out of 20 episodes. And so my challenge to you for season 4 is not to use
I'll find other ways. I'll find another way to reference it.
It's a great concept. The old and ancient Hawaiians were brilliant.
Yeah, I know. I have a tendency to repeat myself very often. And that was indicative of how passionate I am about our food growing here, and the epiphanies and the happy accidents that have happened in the last year, where we watered this garden 5 times in 12 months and we had so much food to share with everyone. And yes, we had a wet year, though it was the input and wisdom from Jeff Lawton and Nadia coming and shaping our food garden that made a lot of that happen. And we were real novices learning along the way, but it was significant moments in the garden that had an impact on me in the last year. And it was really interesting chatting with John when we had the podcast with John, and how psyched he was on growing and
then
keeping
Cyrus,
bees.
we opened the season with Cyrus Sutton.
Same with Cyrus, and then also with Jack Johnson, leading up to chatting with John Florence. I was chatting with Jack just for a bit of insight and whatnot. And he is also part of a big growing project on the North Shore near Haleiwa, which is quite a school as well for kids to experience that. And he was saying how deep the feeling of success is related to that. And that's my broken record thing with people. You would be sick of hearing it, but I say it to anyone who will listen, is that though I've had a very fortunate surfing life, had a lot of wonderful moments that you'd think of as successful, nothing has felt as successful in my bones and in my blood as growing food for our family and other families that we know and love. And that can just perpetuate.
And I think, and in terms of activism, I mean, I think it's something like 1/3 to 1/4 of greenhouse gas emissions are attributable to food systems, the way we produce, package, and ship food around the world. So it really is such the most accessible entry point for engaging with social and environmental issues.
That's right. And it's the relationship to Mama Earth. It's a direct relationship.
Yeah.
And in the Braiding Sweetgrass book, she speaks of that. She says, get a garden going. Anyone, everyone, do it. Just do it and live in relationship with the growing, breathing, living world, Mama Earth. And it just feels really, really special and right.
Last question. Are there any new beliefs, behaviors, or habits that have improved your life recently? I know I ask this question because there's another podcaster who asks this question all the time. And I laughed to myself and thought, Dave is going to totally write off each of those categories and just say he doesn't know what I'm talking about or something. Prove me wrong.
No, that's a wonderful question, Lauren. And a little while ago, I woke up and I think I was just sitting on the deck having a cuppa, looking at the creek, and I was thinking about this line that was in my head, and I wrote it down and put it on the little space we have in the house with treasures that we find at the beach or whatever. And it was just the question, what was your last beautiful act? And I walk past that every day. We all do. And sometimes I don't see it. And then sometimes I do see it. And I think about that. And I like that. It's a nice prompt for me. And it's a question I know you like asking questions, but maybe I do too. And that was a nice one recently. And in terms of even the simple things like, getting on the mower and mowing the lawn. I'm on a stinky thing that's run by fossil fuels, and I'm like doing these laps around the land here to keep a little space free from long grass.
They are in the shape of crop circles.
Well, that was, you just beat me to the punchline there. But I was doing that one day, and I was like, why am I just doing this in concentric rings from the outside shape of the lawn and just doing it in lines, basically? And so I started doing donuts and making them in circles that look like you've thrown pebbles onto the grass, and it's rippled out through the land.
It does look beautiful.
And it's a simple, silly thing, but then we come up onto the deck of the house here and you look down onto the one grassy area we have. We don't really have much at all here in this space, but it's full of these interacting circles. And, that's a silly, dorky thing, and it's part of a silly machine that I use on the land here, but I'd like to think of it that way. I'm like, how can I make something like that a beautiful act?
That's so you, too. Now, getting back to that question about craft, I would say that you are an artist in the truest sense of the word, in that you really make life, everyday life, your art, whether it's making patterns in the grass or
games with the kids,
or the way you make little altar spaces in the garden. You craft things thoughtfully and beautifully, and it's such a joy to get to experience that and learn from you in that way.
Well, that's very sweet, Lauren. Thank you. I appreciate you acknowledging that, and I would like to flick that question back to you. And I wonder if you've thought about it.
I haven't thought about it, but what comes to mind immediately is a ceremony that we begin each year with here at our place called Burn and Bury. Can be B-U-R-Y or B-E-R-R-Y, both work. There's this beautiful ryeberry tree in our front yard, side yard. That's it looks like two trunks, but they're connected at the base. It's this beautiful tree that blushes pink a few times a year, and around Christmas time it fruits. And so a few years ago we decided we would begin the year by burying on a piece of paper. Well, we'd write down a list of the things that we wanted to let go of from the previous year, thoughts, ideas, patterns, habits. We'd write them down, we'd burn the paper into ashes, and then we'd make a list of beautiful things that we'd like to bring to fruition, to experience, wishes, hopes, dreams, prayers, and we would water those wishes into the earth over the things we were burning. And then the sort of ideas that we'd plant all of these things under this tree that we call the wishing tree. And we did that this year. And then we also sit down and sort of ponder on a prompt or a question that might shape how we move through the coming year. And this year, the question that randomly came to me was, or the word that I came up with was kindling. And the question for me this year is, what are you kindling? What fires are you fanning with inspiration, with your own breath? What are you focusing energy into? And equally, what fires are okay to let extinguish? Which are okay to let smolder? What are you going to prioritize and deprioritize? And so I've been coming to that question, over the last month or so, just to have a gentle way to redirect my energy if I feel like I'm a bit unfocused or feeling scattered or something like that. I come back to that question and just ask, what am I kindling? What are you kindling?
It's lovely. And I think one way that you're living that is through your open-mindedness with surfing now. And these are they're silly things we laugh at and everything, like stuff with surfing. It always sounds so cheesy talking about surfing, but your willingness now to ride whatever comes your way is so wonderful to watch, because the ocean in all her moods now is available to you. It's not just about longboard waves. You're riding short and long and wide and thick and 2 fins and 3 even. And the impact of that, I see, is that your real genuine stoke and enthusiasm at looking at the ocean and the conditions now is much broader, and you're just as pumped as I am when there's heaps of swell, and then you're really pumped when there's a little bit of swell and you're on a longboard again, and that's a real privilege to have that sort of choice.
Yeah.
You know, of course. And it is something, though, that I've seen you kindle and bring to life, which is really wonderful.
I think I'm more of a surf rat than I've ever been in my life.
Yeah, both of us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like,
It's hard to believe. It's hard to believe.
Yeah,
really.
Minnow just went to his first play group yesterday and today, and I surfed from 6 o'clock till 11 o'clock in the morning both days. And I look like a leather couch and feel like one too.
Oh, but you're my leather couch.
You know, so it's, I feel like we're really kindling that part of us. That enthusiasm, that active nature worship.
Thanks again for taking the time to listen with us today. We feel so privileged to get to share these conversations as a global community of water folk. If you have a spare moment, please consider leaving a review of the podcast or sharing an episode with a friend. Both help us to find the very best stories from our global community of water people. Many thanks to our sound engineer and editor, Shannon Soul Carroll. The podcast soundtracks are also composed by Shannon, with additional music by the Band of Frequencies. We'll be continuing today's conversation, although sparingly, on Instagram, where we're at Waterpeople Podcast. You can find every episode and some extras on our website, waterpeoplepodcast.com.